The Wind and the Willows, Part 5, read for James and Rhodes Keene by C. The Further Adventures of Toad. Toad woke up early. Sitting up, he rubbed his eyes first and his cold toes next. He wondered where he was. Then, with a leap of his heart, he remembered everything. He remembered the escape. He remembered the train ride. Remembered that he was free. Free! The word and the thought alone were worth 50 blankets. Warm now, he shook himself and marched forth into the sun, hungry but hopeful. After some miles, Toad reached a main road. Far in the distance, he saw a motor car approaching. Hoping for a ride, Toad stepped into the road. Suddenly, his knees turned to water and he collapsed. The car was the same one that he had stolen at the inn. The motor car stopped next to him and two gentlemen jumped out. One of them called to the two women in the car, "How sad! This poor woman has fainted. Let's take her into town. She must have friends there." The men tenderly lifted Toad into the back seat and proceeded on their way. Toad drifted back to his senses. Knowing that he had not been recognized, he cautiously opened one eye and then the other. "Look," said one of the men. "She's better already. How do you feel?" "Thank you kindly, sir," said Toad in a feeble voice. "I'm feeling much better. If I could sit in front next to the driver with the air on my face, I would soon be all right." They carefully helped Toad into the front seat. Toad tried to beat down the old urges that he was feeling. "Please, sir," he said, "I've been watching you carefully. Can I drive? I'd like to be able to tell my friends that I drove a motor car." Before anyone knew it, Toad had taken the wheel. At first, he drove slowly. "Be careful, washerwoman," the others called out. This annoyed Toad. "Washerwoman," he cried as the car leapt to full speed. "No, I'm the Toad who always escapes. Sit still and you shall know what driving really is." With a cry of horror, the others all tried to take the wheel, but the Toad sent the car crashing through a hedge. One mighty bound and the car splashed into a muddy pond. Toad flew through the air and landed on his back with a thump in a soft, rich grass of a meadow. Sitting up, he saw the car in the pond, nearly submerged. Its 4 occupants were floundering angrily in the water. Toad picked himself up and ran as hard as he could across the meadow. In the distance, he could hear shouting and the wail of a police siren. Crashing through the brush, he suddenly realized there was no earth beneath his feet. Splash! He had run straight into the river. He rose to the surface, tossed this way and that by current. Struggling, he saw he was being carried towards a dark hole in the bank. As the water swept past him, Toad reached out and grabbed the edge of the hole. With the last of his strength, he pulled himself out of the water. As he rested, he saw some bright, small thing twinkling in the hole, moving towards him. A face gradually appeared around them, a small brown face with whiskers, neat little ears, and silky hair. It was the rat. Away from home, the rat gripped Toad by the scruff of the neck and hauled his waterlogged friend into the hallway. Toad was overjoyed to be in the house of a friend. "Oh, Ratty," he cried, "I've been through such suffering since I last saw you." "Been in prison. Escaped, of course. Oh, I am a smart Toad. Toad, said the rat sternly, you go take off that dress and clean up right now. I have never seen such a sorry sight. Stop bragging and go. Then Toad returned. The rat spoke. Don't you see what a fool you've been making of yourself? Was it fun being in prison? Do you think it would be fun to break your neck in an accident? I'm going to change my ways, said Toad. Now I'm going to be a good toad. I have an idea. We'll stroll over to Toad Hall and stroll over to Toad Hall, cried the rat. Haven't you heard? Heard what? Said Toad, turning rather pale. The rat's voice was low. When we heard you were in prison, Badger and Mole moved to Toad Hall to keep things in order. But the weasels and the ferrets from the wild wood heard too. They came in the night, dozens of them. They beat Mole and Badger and took over your house. The wild wooders have been there ever since, eating all the food, breaking everything, and making jokes about you. Just then there was a knock, and in walked Badger and Mole. The Badger looked tired, and his feet were covered in mud. The Mole was tired too, and he slumped into a chair. What's it like out there? Asked the rat. About as bad as it can be, said Mole. There are guards everywhere. The Badger walked past them and stood before the fireplace, thinking deeply. The other three sat down and did not speak. Toad was on the sofa with his legs up and his face buried in his knees. He was sobbing. Cheer up, Toady, said the Badger. We're not done yet. I'm going to tell you a secret. Toad sat up slowly and dried his eyes. Secrets were a great attraction to him, because he could never keep one. There's a secret underground passage, said the Badger impressively. Your father told me about it many years ago and asked me to keep it a secret until you had need of it. The secret tunnel leads from the riverbank up into the pantry in the kitchen of Toad Hall. Toad brightened. But how can it help us? He asked. I found out today, continued the Badger, that there's going to be a banquet at Toad Hall tomorrow night. It's the Chief Weasel's birthday. All the weasels will be in the banquet hall eating and drinking and carrying on. They will suspect nothing. We shall jump out of the pantry, cried the Mole. With our pistols and our sticks, cried the Rat. And whack 'em and whack 'em and whack 'em, shouted the Toad gleefully. Well then, said the Badger, our plan is settled. It's getting very late, so let's go to bed at once. We'll be ready tomorrow. The hero's return. The next evening, when it began to grow dark, the rat summoned the others into the parlor. He then dressed them for their adventure. First, there was a belt for each animal and a sword to hang on it. Then everyone received a pistol, a policeman's billy club, several sets of handcuffs, and a lunchbox full of sandwiches. When everyone was ready, the Badger said, Now then, follow me, and Toady, don't chatter, or we'll leave you behind. The Badger led them along the river for a little way. Then he suddenly swung himself into a hidden hole in the riverbank, a little above the water. The others followed. Inside the tunnel, it was cold and damp and low and narrow. Listening for any sound, they shuffled along, their paws on their pistols. The Badger led them for some time and then stopped. We should be under Toad Hall now, he whispered. Above them somewhere, there was a murmur of sound, a confused sound of shouting and cheering and stamping on the floor. What a time they're having, said the Badger. Come on. They hurried along the tunnel until they found themselves standing under a trap door. The weasels were making a tremendous racket. The four friends put their shoulders to the trap door and heaved it back. Hoisting each other up, they found themselves standing in the pantry. Only a door separated them from the banquet hall. The noise was deafening. The weasels were crackling and throwing dishes against the walls. The badger stood tall and firmly gripped his stick with both paws. He glanced at his friends and cried, "The hour has come. Follow me." And he flung the door open wide. My! Squealing and squeaking filled the air. The terrified weasels drove this way and that. Ferrets rushed into the fireplace. Tables and chairs were knocked over and dishes crashed to the floor.